Well, I am so glad to see all of you here. I think the Sunday school class that is meeting will be in here in just a minute, but we'll go ahead and get started. You get all the special information because you're here. So first off, we do have our table over here. We were asked to bring some resources for you. So just some general information. Ryan did talk about Tim Clary's book, Carved in Stone. If you're into geology, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. A good reference, very well done, very well written. A couple of things that we have over there. We do have our brochure that talks more about the society if you want to be a member. If you're here, you can be a member. We have two different categories. One is a voting member. That just means you have an advanced degree in science. If you don't have an advanced degree, then you're a sustaining member. And the only difference is voting members vote, sustaining members don't. So it's not a big deal, but there is that information there. The other thing wanted to let you know about is that we are going to be having our conference next year in July at the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. So if you want to go to the Ark and come hear a lot of science, you can come to our conference. We do have information on the conference with the registration form. There is a holder thing there, was a holder thing there, that talks about the tentative schedule. I'm not seeing it. Okay, so, it's because it's at an angle, I don't see it. Anyway, just gives you the general idea of what the conference is. Ken Ham will be a special speaker for us, so, but it will be at the Ark Encounter. Lots of exciting things at that. If you've never been, it's a wonderful place to go. A couple of other things on the podium little thing here, there's two different resources. One is called, it's a DVD called Evolution versus God. This is done by Ray Comfort, and it's really kind of interesting. He went around to some colleges in California, asking college professors, explain evolution to me. What are your examples of evolution? And their answers are really interesting, is I guess a good way to put it. The other thing we have is a book called Men of Science, Men of God, written by Henry Morris. And so it's just looking at some different things of some scientists and such. That's really good too. Those are our gifts to you. Now, it's first come, first serve. I have a lot there. So if you want one of both, you can have one of both as long as there's each left. I just would ask that, kind of let everybody get something, but I don't think we have that problem today. So just those couple of things, just kind of, like I said, it's a thank you for you guys putting up with us for the 6 weeks. So I am very excited to introduce our speaker today, a good friend of mine and my husband's. Ryan, I guess, kind of likes him too sometimes. But we have Dr. Joseph Kezele and his wife Patty here with us. And Dr. Kezele is an MD. He served for too many years to count as an emergency physician here in the Phoenix area. He has his MD from the University of Arizona in 1975, and now he is a teacher at Arizona Christian University. He doesn't do much. He just teaches like 5 classes a semester sometimes. I mean, no big deal. But he is also president of the Arizona Origin Science Association. They have a district in every county now, 10 different. So it's all over the state of Arizona that they meet and they bring in speakers. And if you want more information, you're more than welcome to come. They meet which day at Arizona Christian? Tomorrow at 7 p.m. on the conference campus. And who's speaking? Ooh, live animals. So snakes and tie building. Yeah. So if you want more information, please, you can talk to Joseph. He can give you all of that, and I'm sure he'd be more than willing to put you on their email list of events that are going on, and you can get more information there. With that, Joseph?
And thank you, folks, for the chance to be here. Let me open this up in prayer and say thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to share knowledge about how you put things together. After all, that's what science is figuring out how you ordered things. So thank you for this. I just pray that this information will be useful, digestible, and shared with others to help them come to salvation through you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So, let's see. There we go. Okay. Well, all right. Okay, I think we're in the wrong PowerPoint here.
Are you going up the big button? Are you hitting the right one?
Is that the top button?
Yeah, I'm doing the top button.
Yeah.
So, let's go backwards.
Chris will figure. There. Okay, so keep going. That was mine. There we go. Oh,
Yep, see, it skips.
It
That's
skipped.
my opening slide.
there.
Are we in that one now? Yes. Okay, I was given 3 questions ahead of time to answer for you folks. And this one was, is the number of chromosome pairs the same for chimps and for man? And so let's take a look. The answer in truth is no. But what the evolutionists do is they take number 2 and number 3 and call them 2A and 2B, so that it looks like the number of chromosomes is the same. So they say that the predecessor to the chimp had 2A and 2B, and they combined to form number 2 in man. But in reality, the chimps actually have 1 more pair of chromosomes than we do. Now, let's take a look at that. So they said that there it is, 2A and 2B, that they combined. And looking at the chromosomes themselves in detail, they say, well, these are the places where they fused, where they came together to form 1 chromosome. But the problem is the place where they say that those 2 chromosomes fuse together is right in the middle of a perfectly functioning gene. And that doesn't happen that way. You don't get a perfectly functioning gene by combining 2 other chromosomes right in the middle of that gene. So that simply does not work. And they also say that these other places that are supposedly showing where special segments were, they're called centromeres, and that there was this supposed hidden one here in the human chromosome 2, again, is in the middle of another perfectly functioning gene, and that just is simply not possible. So it's a sad case of misrepresentation to make it look like there's the possibility of the numbers of chromosomes being the same in chimp and man. So the actual answer is no, they're not the same. They have 1 more pair than we do. And then another thing, just to give a bit more information on this particular topic, is we're told that there are 98.5% similarity between the DNA in people and in chimps. Again, that's a gross case of misrepresentation. What they did was they only looked at the part where the DNA is used to make proteins, and then disregarded everything else that didn't compare, that didn't match up. So the actual direct comparison is about 80%. So there's about a 20% dissimilarity. And this is way too much difference in DNA, given even trillions of years for the chimp DNA to become human DNA, or the predecessor to the chimp to become human DNA. It's simply mathematically impossible. And then just another fun tidbit is that the chimp's genome, in other words, the amount of DNA they have, is 11.5% bigger than ours. Oops, that's the wrong direction. So all sorts of problems with that. So it just simply is not possible for us to have come from them. And then here's what Scripture has to say. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. So, as usual, science gets around to confirming Scripture. Next question that was given to me was, how does the DNA of single-cell organisms compare with that of multicellular organisms? Obviously, we are very multicellular organisms. And so here are 4 characteristics that we're going to take a look at in terms of the nucleus, the form of the chromosome, where the beginning of copying of the DNA happens, and some special proteins called histones. So we're going to look at each of these. But I want to give you a little bit of background so you can understand how this comparison works. All organisms fall into 3 giant categories. And that first one means true bacteria. Eubacteria means true bacteria. The second group are called archaea, and this is, of course, with the evolutionary assumptions in the naming, meaning ancient bacteria. And those two are in the same, or not the same big group, but they have the same similarity in that their nuclei are not defined. They don't have a margin, they don't have a membrane, an envelope around a nucleus. So the DNA is there in the soup. And so those are collectively called prokaryotes, meaning before the nut meaning the nucleus. And so they don't have a defined nucleus. Now there's special proteins in the area of the DNA that do the work of copying the DNA. Whereas eukaryotes, meaning true nut or true nucleus, we, among the other eukaryotes, do have a defined envelope, a double membrane around the nucleus. So there you see that yellow border around the nucleus there. Well, taking a look at bacteria, just for the fun of it, they come in 3 basic shapes: rods, spheres, and spirals. And that's one of the things we use to help identify particular bacteria of interest. Now, looking at the archaea, those ancient things, they are different from bacteria in that they have different kinds of membrane, and they have different enzyme repair systems for DNA than bacteria have, but they are in extreme environments which bacteria cannot handle. So for example, this is one of those hot springs at Yellowstone. And these are boiling hot waters, and these archaea live in these boiling hot waters. I mean, it's really an extreme environment. They also live in those vents in the bottom of the ocean where stuff is coming up out of the crust and coming up into the ocean floor. And this is, again, boiling hot stuff. And they live there in those vents in the bottom of the ocean floor. Some of them live in the ice, like in Antarctica or in Greenland. And you see that yellow patch, it's not because an elephant urinated there. It's because those archaea convert sulfur into the elemental form, and you see the yellow color, even though it's at freezing temperature. So this is another extreme environment. And then also some of them live in these extremely salty bodies of water in the deserts here, where water evaporates and leaves the salt content at a very high level. So these are the kinds of places that archaea live in. So these are collectively called extremophiles, loving extreme environments. But I'm going to give you one more that is a true bacteria. It's not archaea, true bacteria. And its name itself is really interesting. It's called Deinococcus radiodurans. Dino from the same root as in dynamite and dinosaur, meaning very powerful, awesome, overwhelming. And coccus meaning sphere, because it has that round shape. There's two of them there. Radiodurans. These things live in atomic nuclear reactors. So there's probably some of them in Palo Verde here, in the electrical plant there. They have these amazing DNA repair systems that they can handle the intense radiation in these nuclear reactors, and they're very happy. They also can live in vacuums, and they can live almost anywhere. But we don't have to worry about that because they don't like the conditions in our bodies, so they don't cause diseases for us, so we don't have to worry about them. So now, aside from the prokaryotes, meaning the true bacteria and the archaea, now the eukaryotes, the true karyotes. And that original question was differences in one-celled organisms versus multicellular organisms. So here you see an amoeba. That's a unicellular organism. It is a eukaryote. It's not a bacterium. Okay, this is a one-celled alga or algae, plural. Then these beautiful things that have all sorts of shapes, totally natural. These live in the ocean, and they take the silicon from the ocean water and make a glass shell around the individual cell. And some of these are in triangles, some of them spindle-shaped, some of them round, some of them square. It's amazing. And these is then yeast, one-celled fungus. So these are one-celled eukaryotes. But we also have versions of these in multiple cellular organisms. And so here is kelp. Kelp is a macroalgae, multicellular algae, instead of just the one cell, the one to its left. Or fungus. Yeast and fungus are in the same grouping, but it's one cell versus multicellular. But they're all with the true nucleus, with the membrane around the nucleus. And then plants, and then animals. So these four groupings within the eukaryotes are the multicellular algae, as well as the multicellular fungus, plants and animals, as well as those unicellular examples there on the left. Those are all in that eukaryote group, the true nucleus. Now, what animal is that? It's a gazelle. It's me. I'm a gazelle. It's a gazelle. All right? I'm fast and fleet like it. And I'm cute, too. All right. So going back to looking at the bacterium and the archaea, there is what's called the nucleoid, because it means nucleus-like. Oid means like. And so it is a single chromosome in a very long, big circle, very big loop. And it does not have the membrane around it. It has some special proteins associated with it to do the work of multiplying, to replicate, copy itself. And then there's little small circles of DNA called plasmids. And those are for the purpose of transferring genetic information to other organisms that are alive at the same time. So this would be called horizontal gene transfer from organism to organism that are not the offspring, as opposed to vertical gene transfer from parent to offspring, vertical line from generation to the next generation. So that's a nucleoid. Whereas in the eukaryotes, we have the true nucleus with the envelope, the double membrane around the nucleus, defining it very clearly. And it has special pores that control what get in and out of that nucleus, raw materials coming in and products coming out, like messenger RNA, for example. So here's an example of an organism that has 4 total chromosomes, say two pairs of chromosomes, and that would be that type of fly. And this was identified from a lake in Siberia. It's a Diptera, 2-winged fly is the grouping of those critters, as opposed to this one that has 23 pairs. And that would be us. That's what the map is of our DNA. So you see there's a giant difference between those one-celled organisms on the left that have just the one circle of DNA for itself and then some small plasmids to share with other organisms, as opposed to our 23 pairs of very well-defined chromosomes in a very well-protected nucleus. So that's the answer to that question. Are you there? Are you with it? Okay. One other point about this is that for the DNA to be copied, it has to be able to open up so that the machines, the proteins called polymerases, can get to it and copy it to make a copy. So in the bacteria, there's only one place where it opens up, one origin of replication. In the archaea, it can be only one in some of them, and others, there may be a few, like 2 or 3 places where they open up. In the eukaryotes, there are many, many, many places where it opens up at the same time because there's so much DNA involved that you start in multiple places at the same time. It's like when they do these road projects and they're repaving a very long stretch, instead of having just one set of machinery, they'll have 8 or 10. And they're starting at different places all at the same time, so they work together. And that's the same thing that happens here, so that it can happen much more quickly that way. Does that make sense? The other thing is, in eukaryotes, we especially see these very special rounded proteins that are used to organize the DNA, to keep everything from getting tangled up. Murphy's Law, if it can possibly tangle up at will, with all the cords we use around here. So these special proteins are used to wrap around, kind of like wrapping around hair curlers, to keep everything organized. And you see that they form these groups in chains that are then organized. And as you go back up into the top and to the left, there you see that total chromosome. And as you unwind it at each level of organization, you finally get down to the most open form there. So here is what this looks like, and they are numbered H2A and B, H3 and H4, H for histone. And so there's 2 of each of those forming a group of 8 of those proteins, and the DNA, as you see in that yellow color, wraps around it. And then you see a triangle there with phosphate, and you see more purple color thing with methyl, and then acetyl group. So here's a phosphate group, there's a methyl group, and this is an acetyl group. You know acetyl groups because when you use vinegar, it's acetic acid. So when you're using salad dressing with vinegar, that's what you're using, a very weak acid there. So these things are used as a code, and it's a very complex code, to tell the DNA to be tightly wrapped or loosely wrapped around these histone proteins so that the machinery needed to copy the DNA or to read the DNA to make the messenger RNA can have access to the DNA. So that's a whole nother code system that's totally separate from the DNA code itself, to know whether or not the DNA can be accessible so that the protein can be made or not. Okay? And then, but you say, well, why do we have 2, 3, and 4? Where's number 1? Well, there's number 1, and that's called a linker histone. And this involves connecting the DNA coming from the last bead, so to speak, to the next one, keeping everything organized so it doesn't get tangled. So this is a complex system of organization and for regulation. Well, in bacteria, they have no histone proteins. Archaea, some do, some don't. And in the eukaryotes, including us, we have lots. All eukaryotes have histone proteins. So there's the total information that we just went over, summed up in that one slide. So this answers, how does the DNA of single-cell organisms compare with that of multicellular organisms. Are we good? All right. Next question. Do you have a date with carbon-14? All right. These are the things we're going to look at to try and explain this question. I have to give you some background, and that is that carbon comes in three forms. They're all carbon because they all have the same number of protons, but they have different numbers of neutrons in that nucleus, 6, 7, and 8. Carbon 12 and 13 are very stable, totally stable, and they make up, you add up those two numbers, it comes to 100%. Well, carbon 14, look at that. It's 1 in a trillion carbon atoms is carbon 14, 1 in a trillion. That's why the other two numbers add up to 100, because there's such a small amount of it. It's formed very high in the atmosphere by radiation from the sun, knocking around the atoms up in the atmosphere and converting nitrogen into carbon 14. So that's how it's formed, way up there. All right, our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. Room air contains 21% oxygen. So in medicine, we say keep the patient on room air, meaning 21% oxygen. And then if we give them a higher amount of oxygen, then it's either through those nasal cannula or through a ventilator, through a tube. All right, so there's that radiation from the sun converting nitrogen into carbon-14. Well, through experiments which did not take 5,730 years, which were done much more quickly in the lab, but using heat to speed up the system, and in using a very special mathematical equation to be able to convert that into real time, it shows that after that number of years, half of the carbon-14 falls apart. It decays. And in that same number of years, again, the second time period, half of that falls apart. So after each period of that number of years, you get half of half of half of half of half. And then finally, you get to where, and again, I have to say 500 times, this number of years is an evolutionary assumption. Evolutionary assumption. This is not the biblical time frame by any means. But if things had been going on as long as 80 to 100,000 years, there would not be enough carbon-14 left to be able to measure it. The amount would be so minuscule. There would be a tiny amount, it would be there, but so we wouldn't be able to measure it. So using the evolutionary time scale, using the evolutionary way of thinking about time, if something is older than 80 to 100,000 years, you wouldn't be able to find any measurable carbon-14. Hey, what's this, Kezele? Chemistry equations? Do you enjoy your job here as a cartoonist, Kezele? All right, so the carbon-14 in the atmosphere gets into plants through photosynthesis because it becomes part of carbon dioxide. Animals eat the plants, we eat animals, so everybody is in equilibrium. Everybody has that same ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in our bodies. You have carbon-14, you're radioactive, okay? You have carbon-14 in you. All right, so we eat the stuff, and so we have that ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in our bodies in equilibrium with the environment until the organism dies. Why? Well, it's because it's no longer can eat and take in any more carbon-14, but what's in the remains of that organism continues to decay. All right? So that changes that ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14. There's less of 14 in relationship to the amount of 12. All right. Now, there are three underlying assumptions, all based on this tenet, this doctrine of evolution called uniformitarianism, the U word. Uniformitarianism, meaning uniform, that all things, all physical processes go on at a uniform rate, at a constant rate, unchanging rate. And at that rate that we measure today is the rate that has always gone on in the past without change. Always gone on in the past without change. The rate of whatever it is we're talking about, whether it's erosion in the Grand Canyon, whether it's the amount of salt coming from the continents into the ocean, or the rate of radioactive decay. Never changes. Okay, so that's the basis, uniformitarianism. And so with that, also that the ratio, the amount of carbon-12 to 14, comparing them, has always been the same in the past. So this is one of those three critical assumptions underlying this system of carbon dating. I see taking pictures of slides. I'm going to leave the PowerPoint here so that Pastor can distribute the PowerPoint and make it available for you. So you don't have to, so that way you can have the whole thing. So the first assumption, the ratio of carbon 14 and 12 has always been the same. Well, we have beautiful, real, scientific, experimental evidence to show that's not true. So in 1908, this meteor exploded very low in the atmosphere over Siberia in the Stony Tunguskaya River Basin. And you see here a picture of the forest that was devastated by this meteor exploding low in the atmosphere. That threw up a horrendous amount of carbon into the atmosphere. So down at the University of Arizona in Tucson is the world's premier center for studying tree rings. Tree rings. Dendro refers to tree, dendrochronology, tree dating. So counting the rings, you know when this particular tree was cut, you count the rings and you can identify different rings with different years. Dendrochronology. So specimens were taken, and then from particular rings, measurements were taken of carbon-12 and carbon-14, and it showed that the ratio was widely, all around the world, greatly altered from this event of this meteor exploding in the atmosphere in Siberia. So we have perfectly beautiful scientific evidence to show that the ratio is not constant, that it does change with catastrophic events. Other things that change the ratio are volcanoes as well. They spew horrendous amounts of carbon into the atmosphere and change the ratio. Not only that, but as I mentioned to you, the formation of carbon-14 is high in the atmosphere. So when there is a humongous solar flare or a supernova exploding close by, that radiation intensity also altered the rate of carbon-14 formation. So again, we know from tree ring samples that this happened after a supernova or a solar flare that was much larger than usual occurred in the year 774, 775 AD, that the carbon-14 to 12 ratios in the wood from specimens we can date back were changed. So this is beautiful evidence. The ratio is not constant. The second assumption is that the original amount of the parent element that decays to the daughter element is known when the specimen was formed. And the assumption, and this is a horrendous assumption, is that it was 100% of the parent element and 0% of the daughter element when this specimen was formed. But no one can know this. This is unknowable. As God said, where were you when I laid down the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding, in Job. So that is a very, I would say, ridiculous assumption. The third assumption is that the rate of decay has never changed. So the first assumption was the ratio of carbon-12 to 14 has never changed. And we wiped that one out with the dendrochronology samples. The second one, that the amount of element, daughter element, is 0, and the parent element 100% in the specimen when it was formed. That's unknowable. The third one here, that the rate of decay has never changed. It's always been the same in the past. Well, beautiful, beautiful work done by the Creation Research Society in conjunction with the Institute for Creation Research. And that's a whole nother talk by itself, by an hour. But the results of that beautiful work done now, just about 20 years ago, showed that indeed the rate of radioactive decay had to have changed dramatically in the past. Dramatically in the past, by a huge factor of over 250,000 times. Okay, like I say, the presentation about that is a whole hour, but just beautiful work that shows that the rate of radioactive decay had to have been changed at least by a factor of 250,000 times in the past. And evolutionists can't counter the work that was done in this experiment. They've tried to explain it away, but unsuccessfully. So it was involving uranium and helium, and it's very elegant, very beautiful experiment. And the beauty of it is the samples were submitted to labs that the evolutionists used, and so they couldn't accuse the creationists of cooking the data. It was very slick. All right, so the nuclear decay rate had to have changed in the past by this huge factor. So billions of years worth of decay actually occurred only in 6,000 years. So this means that the rate of decay was super, super much faster than now. So accelerated nuclear decay. Any kind, well, it doesn't matter what kind of isotope you're talking about, whether it's uranium or whether it's carbon or oxygen or whatever. All right, it says here, you're doing cave drawings with carbon sticks? Yeah, 1,000 years from now, archaeologists will go ape trying to date these suckers. All right, well, let's take a look at coal diamonds, carbon dioxide, and methane, because those are all things containing carbon, and those can be used to measure the ratios of carbon-12 and carbon-14. And the thing is, we are told with the evolutionary assumptions that everything in the past was very slow, very gradual at the rate at which it's observed today. And they tell us that millions of years ago, 200-300 million years ago, that plants in the swamps would fall over and take zillions of years to get buried and be compressed and finally be pressed into forming coal. Well, there are multiple examples around the world of these trees that are found in vertical positions. And the evolutionists interpret the rock record to say that these multiple layers here that you see burying the tree represent many thousands of years. But is any self-respecting tree going to stand up for many thousands of years waiting to get buried and not be eaten by termites or decay by fungus or by bacteria? And the answer is no. So these had to be catastrophically buried. Can you think of something that might catastrophically bury trees around the world? Yeah, a flood, he says. Oh, yeah. So we're told that, in spite of that, we're told that these trees fell over, slowly got buried over many thousands of years, and then finally were turned into coal by pressure and heat. And that this happened 300 to 360 million years ago, according to the way they interpret the layers of stuff in the planet. So, with those humongous ages, should there be any measurable carbon-14? And the answer is no, because we said the maximum that can be measured using the evolutionary concept of time is 80 to 100,000 years. And here we're talking 200, 300, 360 million years. And the answer is no, there should not be measurable amount of carbon-14. So specimens were taken from this coal bank at Penn State University, where the samples from coal mines around the country were put in these special containers in argon gas so that oxygen couldn't do anything to the coal, and then preserve them under refrigeration so that nothing would change the specimens. And so various specimens were taken, and they all have, as you see on the far right-hand side of the slide, measurable amounts of carbon-14. So they cannot possibly be these millions of years old. Well, the evolutionist said, but coal is soft stuff. Maybe something got washed in or washed out. Okay, well, let's look at diamonds. Diamonds are the hardest substance known to man, and they're coal, carbon like coal, and they're formed in the crust of the earth. So remember we said carbon-14 is formed very high in the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, way up there. Diamonds are formed in the crust. And so there are areas where stuff would come from the deeper material in the earth and push through, and these diamonds would be pushed up into the surface very quickly, as they're able to determine by examining the other rocks there and doing some calculations. And how long ago did the evolutionists tell us that this happened? Well, from 1 billion to 3.3 billion years ago. All right? So that's how long ago diamonds supposedly formed. Well, thinking about the flood, all of this stuff would have been laid down in 1 year. The flood was 1 year and 1 week long. About 4,360 years ago. These colored regions are where countries in which diamonds are found, and notice it's kind of like two bands north and south of the equator there. And so experiments were done not with those beautiful gemstones, but with the cheap industrial grade diamonds. And so they were evaluated for carbon-14. And so with their ages of 1 billion to 3.3 billion years, should there be any measurable carbon-14? And the answer is no. And indeed, guess what? All of the diamond specimens from various places indeed have measurable carbon-14. Well, you can't accuse the situation of contamination by something being washed out or washed in, since the diamonds are the hardest natural substance known to man. So these are real findings. Well, okay, what about carbon dioxide gas from methane mines here in these various locations in the four corner states? And all of these things have measurable amounts of carbon-14. Now, using the evolutionary assumptions, the dates come down to just a few tens of thousands of years, using their assumptions. But when you correct for their assumptions, it comes down to the biblical time frame. What about carbon-14 in us, in our bodies? Well, how about carbon-14 in fossils? Now, everybody assumes all fossils are organisms turned into rock. Well, that's not always the case. There are lots of remains of organisms that still have soft tissue in them that have not been turned into stone. And here's a quote from an evolutionist saying that 70% of the volume of that specimen is still soft tissue, organic material, not turned into stone. Okay, this might be hard to read, but this is a list of various dinosaur specimens with soft tissue that have measurable carbon-14. And you say, what? They're supposed to have been extinct like 85 million years ago. Well, no, that's not the case, because we have measurable carbon-14 in soft tissue. Multiple examples. Amber also has carbon-14 in it. It's supposedly 15 to 310 million years old. That's way past that 80 to 100,000 years the evolutionists talk about. How about if you take a living snail and kill it? It dates at 27,000 years. This shows the system doesn't work. How about if you killed a seal and measure it? Oh, 1,300 years old. Huh. Well, what about carbon-14 formation during the flood? So here you see the patriarchs and the ages, and you see here the line representing the flood. And we know from the genealogies given us in chapters 5, 10, and 11 in Genesis that the ages were much longer prior to the flood than after. Well, there's several thoughts about things such as the concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere prior to the flood and other things, but most likely it was due to this intense period of radiation with accelerated nuclear decay, radiation occurring during the year of the flood, and then the effects on the genetics and the shortened lifespans afterwards. Well, carbon-14 is everywhere. Evolutionists like to say, oh, well, it was just contamination of the specimen. But no, not when you have it measurable in everything. So here's a quiz. There's always got to be a quiz, right?
I warned them there would be a quiz.
Okay, well, you were correct. You were correct. All right. So after how many years should there be no measurable carbon-14? Okay, 80 to 100,000 years. Rocks and fossils supposed to be older than this age should be carbon-14, free or dead or empty, okay? But carbon-14 is found everywhere, in everything. Initially, this was attributed to contamination, but now we know that this is real, inherent. It really belongs there. So a very big question, okay? Carbon-14 is formed high up in the atmosphere. How did it get into those diamonds that are buried deep and come from the crust? I think there's a little event called Noah's flood that took all that plant material and buried it and compressed it and formed the diamonds. Okay. So, radioactive dating. All right, I was given another question, and it was written out here. And it says, please help me answer this question from an atheist. If God placed stars millions of light years away when he created the universe, then how are we able to see the light from those stars if the universe is only 6,000 years old? Well, first of all, it's very important to understand that the term light year is a measure only of distance. It is not a measure of time. And it's about 5.82 trillion miles. That's how far light travels in a year. A lot of people round it up to 6 trillion. So, how did light come from that great distance? I cannot comprehend the genius of Einstein. I cannot grasp how smart he really was, how he had that great smarts. But without computers, without any technology, just out of sheer genius, he figured out theories which we are now proving to be true with actual experimental evidence. And one of the aspects of his theory of relativity is that gravity slows down time. Where gravity is stronger, time ticks more slowly. You say, what? Time does not run at the same speed everywhere. Sounds crazy. But I can guarantee you, you all on a very practical daily basis have dealt with that issue. It's in her purse. The GPS systems in our phones and in our other gizmos, those satellites are way up there, high above the planet. And because the force of gravity is significantly weaker there than down here, time runs faster up there. And engineers have to compensate for that so that your GPS puts you where you actually are. This is real. This is real. This is not theoretical. Einstein was absolutely correct. So, remembering that the light year is a measure only of distance and not of time. You have Earth at or very near the center of the universe. During creation week, especially day 4, the planet is finished being formed on day 3. Then on day 4, sun, moon, and stars, verse 16 of chapter 1 of Genesis. That's when God creates all that stuff. And so before he does that, think of the Earth being at this little small dot in the middle of this huge universe. Gravity is intense at the center of the universe and hardly existent out there. So that the clocks on Earth are running, in comparison to out there, very slowly. Or we should say, out there running much faster compared to the clocks on Earth. Now this is the super oversimplified version. But these are the basic important points. So that way the clocks out there can run at speeds of billions of years, while the clocks on Earth are acting normally from your perspective here on Earth. So that's how we can have an Earth that's 6,000 years old, but out there things looking billions of years old. And it's not a trick of making things appear old. It's the fact that time ran so much faster out there. And so light being able to travel, get here. Now, it's more complicated than that, but those are the important points to be able to explain to someone who's, not a cosmologist, one who studies the origins of the universe. I think that's adequate information to have, to be able to make the point that, yes, it's possible. And that once again, as we get more actual experimental data, Scripture is confirmed. Does that answer it adequately, you think? Who asked the question? Does that answer it well enough for you? All right. I've got 5 minutes here. Let me think if there's something else I should say about that. Just a tidbit. We are so blessed to have these scientific instruments to be able to see the true beauties out there in space that previous generations never had a chance of seeing. All they could see was what the naked eye or regular telescopes could see, at least in the solar system. But today, for several decades we'll be able to enjoy what Hubble showed us. But now there's a new player in town, the James Webb Space Telescope. JWST it's called. And that is a telescope that's out in orbit way, way far away from the Earth in a special location between Earth and Sun. And it's set up so that it's shielded by the Earth from the Sun, and so it can see much further than Hubble. And so now the astronomers are realizing that Hubble could only see about 13.7 light years away from here. But with James Webb now, it may be that we're actually going to end up seeing about 27 billion light years out there. The universe is actually, the diameter is actually twice as what we thought it was. So we really don't know how big the universe is. We just know that it's more than we can figure out. And this really drives the astronomers, the Big Bang people, crazy, because they're seeing galaxies that are formed supposedly earlier than stars were supposed to be forming. The Big Bang is dying. It is absolutely dying. And I'll stop with that. Thank you. One thing. I would like to especially bring your attention to Dr. Anderson's last DVD, The Who of Creation. This is a phenomenal presentation. And there are the 4 questions that he addresses very elegantly. Where did I come from? Why am I here? What is my purpose? And where am I going? These are questions that people start addressing in their teen years as they start thinking about stuff. You guys should buy these out. They should go home with none of these. Okay? And not only for yourselves, but for other people who don't yet know Christ as their Savior. All right? These are marvelous, marvelous, marvelous. All right.
So we did record the classes, and so if you missed one, we will let you know how to access anything, but they will all be available for your use later on. So please help yourself to the free stuff. We do have stuff for sale. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Like I said, I do have some connections to some other people. And if Joseph can't help me, I'm sure we can find somebody else who can answer it also. But thank you so much. We so appreciate you coming and hope you learned something.